So it's good to have you here, present in person. Any of you who will be joining us either live on Zoom or watching the recording later on as we get a chance today to look at that Bible book called Judges. And we'll mention a little bit more about that. Well, let's start with the review of the last session. If someone wants to open up to page 22 and read 12a.
The goal of Joshua is not merely to describe the conquest, but to proclaim to the Israelites the dramatic story of the Lord's victory over Joshua. The book sets out to inscribe on the people's memory the fact that their victories were won, not by their military power, but by the Lord, who brought them into the land, who led them in their military struggles, and overcame their opponents.
So God is the one who's delivering the land to them. And some of the unsavory things that we read about in Joshua will get a little different picture in Judges. This is the only picture from that lesson, but it kind of gives the sense of some broad quick strikes. This section here on the east bank, as it's referred to, of the Jordan River, is land and territory they conquered prior to the narrative Joshua at the end of the book of Numbers. And then they come in and, of course, will conquer Jericho. After some troubles, they'll get Ai. They'll make a little partnership with the people of Gibeon and the surrounding region. That leads to this campaign in the south, followed up by another campaign in the north. And you get the idealized picture that the land had rest from war, that everything was taken care of. And yet even in Joshua, and we'll see it more in Judges, that may be a more idealized sense of what happened, because even in Joshua we read about how, but this tribe couldn't drive out this people, or this tribe couldn't take full possession in this area. So doesn't take away some of the unsavory fighting and destruction and annihilation that we read about, but it does give it a little different context. But let's look then at some of those elements that are listed in the sections below. So somebody take the bullet points from 12b.
Prior to undertaking the conquest, the Israelites make arrangements to ensure the safety of the women and children of the tribes who will eventually settle in the territory on the east of the Jordan, to the east of the Jordan. Send spies to survey the land and the city of Jericho, pass through the waters of the Jordan River, which stop flowing, and wall up to permit the Israelites to enter the promised land in a liturgical procession led by the Levitical priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Erect memorial stones to serve as an enduring reminder of their entry into the land. Circumcise all males born after the Exodus from Egypt and celebrate a special Passover event in Gilgal on the west bank of the Jordan River.
Okay, so lots of that preparatory stuff. Somebody take 12c.
After the Israelites crossed the Jordan, Joshua carries out several military campaigns in Canaan. In the first, he gains control of Canaan's central region, chapters 6 through 8. In the second, he conquers the land's southern region, chapters 9 through 10. In the third, the Israelites capture the northern section of Canaan in chapter 11. The land is then divided among the tribes, although some passages in Joshua suggest that the conquest was swift and complete. Other passages, such as 18:2-10, and see also Judges 1:1 to 3:6, suggest that the Israelites were unable to expel the Canaanites from a number of regions.
Yeah, reference that. And what's interesting, if you look at the chapters, you really have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 are really the only chapters that talk about kind of the battles or the conquest. And so many people, when we get to the book of Joshua, we think, oh, that's all about taking possession of the promised land. Well, really, it's just a portion of the book that talks about that. And there's many other things, and most of it's given over to the allotments and the descriptions of the territory that the different tribes are going to have, which is what the next one's about. So somebody take 12d.
Joshua 13:21 reports how the land was divided among the tribes. 6 cities of refuge were established, 3 on each side of the Jordan River. The Levites, the priestly tribe, were allocated cities, not territory.
Okay, so, and finally, the last one.
Just as Moses, prior to his death, had exhorted the Israelites to remain true to the covenant God had made them with, wait a minute. To the covenant God had made with them at Sinai, Joshua 24:1-28 describes Moses' successor, Joshua, doing the same during a covenant ceremony at Shechem, located between Mounts Ebal and Gerizim. This final chapter also describes the death and burial of Joshua and Eleazar and the interment of Joseph's bones at Shechem. While the conquest was being carried out, major powers of the north and south of the promised land were preoccupied with internal troubles, which made it impossible for them to police what was taking place in Canaan.
So that last little sentence is kind of interesting too, from the perspective of history. It appears that the time when the Israelites entered in and took whatever measure of control of the promised land they may have had occurred at a time when the surrounding countries were in the midst of their own stuff, making it not so difficult to do that. But so we're going to move on to Judges. But before we do that, I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 50. And we're going to just look in particular at verses 22 through the end. So basically, depending on how your Bible divides it up, the last 1 or 2 paragraphs of the book of Genesis, if someone would read that.
So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children at the 3rd generation. The children of Mashur, son of Manasseh, were also born on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, when God comes to you, you shall carry up my bones from here. And Joseph died. Being 110 years old, he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt.
So it's kind of a summary closing, right? You kind of basically, okay, folks, we've gotten to the end of this narrative. Here's a little bit of detail about how it kind of finishes up, but this sort of end of story, right? And then flip to Exodus chapter 1, and somebody read the first 7 verses there.
These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt when Joseph died, all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them.
Okay. So when I was a boy growing up, the old Adam West, Burt Ward Batman series was on TV. And there were occasions when one episode bled into the next one. And on those few times, the announcer would begin by saying, in our last episode, and then there would be this little quick summary of what had happened. That's kind of what's happening here in these opening verses of Exodus. And then in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, we read, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And so now the next leg of the story, the next leg of the narrative is going to unfold. And here we read about how Pharaoh looks out, this new king looks out, sees all these Israelites who had had a position of privilege under Joseph, but he doesn't know anything about Joseph. And so now they're going to be enslaved. And there you go. Okay. So we saw this transition from Exodus, or from Genesis to Exodus. Now we're getting ready to go to Judges. So let's look at the final chapter of Joshua. We just did a little quick summary of that. And here we're going to pick up verses 29 through the end of the chapter. Somebody could read that, Joshua 24.
After this, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at age 110. They buried him in the land he had been allocated at Timnah Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. The people of Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, those who had personally experienced all that the Lord had done for Israel. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought along with them when they left Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the plot of land Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor for 100 pieces of silver. This land was located in the territory allotted to the descendants of Joseph. Eleazar, son of Aaron, also died. He was buried in the hill country of Ephraim and the town of Gibeah, which had been given to his son, Phinehas.
Okay, so a similar sort of wrapping up of the Joshua story. We have Joshua's death. We have information about how those who had seen, remember the context was anybody who was 20 years old or older, when they came out of the land of Egypt, were going to die in the wilderness because they didn't trust that God could lead them in. And so it was the younger generation, if you will, who still had some memory of that. They became elders, they became involved, but now you've got the transition. And sometimes we're people who expect patterns, right? So it's like, okay, well, we had this nice little ending at the end of Genesis. And then when we got into Exodus, it was, uh-oh, let's see what happens in the book of Judges. Because we have this nice little ending at the end of Joshua. And Judges begins with a phrase that you probably all have that goes something like this: after the death of Joshua, right? I'll read. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And you're going, huh? I thought they already did that, right? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand. Judah said to his brother Simeon, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. Then I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you. What's it sound like is happening? One tribe is now, remember the Joshua, after all those conquest narratives that we read, there were 11 through 6. There were 6 chapters in that list. Then there were 9 chapters in the list of allotting the territory. And here it sounds like they're going to each go. And in this instance, Judah's going first. And they say to Simeon, right? Is it Simeon? Yeah. Says to Simeon, hey, you go, let's make a team. And we're going to do this. And so we're told that they went up. The Lord gave the Canaanites, the Perizzites into their hands. They defeated their 10,000 in Bezek. They came up against this king, Adoni-Bezek, in Bezek, and they fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. This guy fled. They caught him and they did a little post-capture nastiness, right? What'd they do? Yeah, and of course you cut off thumbs. You can't hold, right? So he's not going to be able to fight. You cut off his toes. He's not going to be able to move. I mean, so they essentially kind of handicap him, is an old way of saying it. And then, of course, that king references what? I did the same thing, right? So I don't know if we use this phrase anymore, but when I was younger, we talked about somebody getting their own medicine, right? Get a taste of their own medicine, kind of a thing. And this is what happened to him. And it says at the end of verse 7, they brought him back to Jerusalem. And then in fact, this is the people fought against Jerusalem and took it. They put the city to the sword. It set a fire there. Afterward, they went down and fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country. And they did this in Hebron, that was used to be called Kiriath Arba. They defeated, you get some more names of people. And we're just kind of getting some information about how the tribe of Judah is sort of systematically conquering territory, but in a much different kind of way than we read about in Joshua. And then you get some little bit of nastiness. For example, verse 17, Judah went with his brother Simeon. They defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction. So the city was called Hormah, which if you have a footnote means just simply destruction. Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, Ekron with its territory. Remember, those are Philistine cities. We're going to hear about those. And of course, Gaza we still hear about. The Lord was with Judah. He took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain. So, yes, the battle is unfolding, but it's not necessarily complete. We hear about Hebron giving to Caleb. And then we hear in verse 21, the Benjaminites, this is interesting, the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, so the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjaminites to this day. And it's like, well, wait, I thought I was just reading about Judah and Jerusalem. So there are some things that are unsettled that we don't exactly, we can't figure it out. But then in verse 22, Joseph goes up and they send out spies to Bethel. Wait a minute, I thought Bethel was so this is where scholars read both the Judges account and the Joshua account, and there's no really easy way to make them mesh perfectly. And so, as I told you probably in our very first session, surprise, surprise, Bible scholars disagree about these things, and we're just left with a little bit of uncertainty and wondering. I think I shared with you the explanation that sounds reasonable to me is that Joshua is perhaps a bit more idealized, but again, who knows for sure? But they're essentially kind of taking territory. In verse 27, it's Manasseh. In verse 29, it's Ephraim. In verse 30, it's Zebulun. In verse 31, it's Asher. In verse 33, it's Naphtali. In verse 34, we hear about the Danites. And the Danites, it is not so good. We'll follow that up a little bit more. But in several of these little sections, and sometimes it's just a verse or two, we get the sense that the people didn't completely push out the inhabitants. So let's go ahead and look quick at this Judges. Again, just our Hebrew Bible. This is now the seventh book that we're going to be looking at. And I think I shared with you last year. In fact, it was the last 2 years. I try to read through a version of the Bible every year. And I come back to the New Revised Standard sort of every other year. And then I try to read a version that's a little different. So last year, I read the Hebrew Bible, published by the Jewish Publication Society. So I read the Bible, Old Testament, in this order that you see in this illustration. And I took a peek at it again today. Instead of using the word judge, they use the word champion. And sometimes the word chieftain. Because again, we think judge, we think courtroom. That's not what this is. The judges are these kind of military champions, these military leaders who rise up to fight. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting explanation. But we're going to pick up again. Here's your timeline. We're working our way through. This is this sojourn in Egypt. And now we're kind of looking at this stretch of time here, although it's with some, again, speculation, because when you look at your picture from page 24, you can see the tribes in the different places, and there's no guarantee that these things are, sort of sequential, right? Some of them could be happening at the same time. So it's a little bit of a guess as to when they are. But these numbers here, so you've got this kind of multicolored section representing, if again, look at page the illustration on this next illustration, you see the multicolors here. So we've got this multicolored section and we have black numbers, and you actually have to go back here at the beginning of your timeline in this upper section, you'll see the black numbers. And interesting, the first one listed is Joshua, even though he's in the previous story. And the last one we're going to read about is Samuel, and we'll be getting to Samuel in the next unit. So that's why the numbers don't always jibe. If you're reading about the judges and somebody says, well, the second judge, going back here, the second judge was Ehud, and you say, yeah, but my timeline says it's number 3. That's because they probably weren't counting Joshua as a chieftain, as a champion. So, but this is where we're at in the timeline. So here, this picture, you see the different tribes, and we'll spend a little bit of time breaking that down, but you're constantly getting this phrase, but so-and-so didn't drive out so-and-so. This tribe didn't drive out that group. And when we get to the section on Dan, we hear later on about how they say, you know what, God, you assigned us a really tough area. We're going to go find an easier place to conquer, which is what they do later in the book. So does that help with chapter 1 a little bit, getting a setup? But then it gets confusing again. Somebody read chapter 2, verses 1 through 5.
Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and they sacrificed to the Lord.
Okay. So this is a rather ominous beginning, right? Just like, now there was a new king who did not know Joseph. I mean, it starts off sounding like, well, okay, it's a little different, but it's working. Each person is going to their places. Sometimes they buddy up with a neighbor tribe and they go and they attack. But when we get to chapter 2, a different picture is pointed out. And again, Bochim or Bochim means weeping or weepers. It's tears. It's a sad place. So it gets to be a sad place because they get this sad news. What's the news? God isn't going to help you if you make these covenants, right? And so the overarching concern that began already as they were getting close to the promised land is they're going to pony up to these foreign gods. And of course, that's exactly what's going to happen. And will continue to happen over and over and over through that narrative that we're going to be working our way through over the next several units. And then comes something even stranger. What do we have? In verses 6 through 10. Joshua's death is told us again. So it's like, okay, so maybe the stuff talked about in chapter 2 happened before chapter. I mean, it's hard to piece it together, but somebody read about Joshua's death.
After Joshua sent the people away, each of the tribes left to take possession of the land allotted to them. And the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him, those who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the land that had been allocated at Timnath Sarai in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel.
Uh-oh, right? It's bad enough when it says, now a new king arose who did not know Joseph. But now you have a new generation of Israelites who did not know the Lord. And you think, oh, this isn't going to be good. And it isn't. And we get this cycle that begins, somebody 11 through 15.
Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshiped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them, and bowed down to them. Worship Baal and the Astars. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out of the hand of the Lord against them to bring this.
Start that sentence again.
Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune. And as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress.
All right. So here's the cycle, right? Here's the picture for Judges. And what do you see in that upper corner? Here's a farmer with the fertility goddess in the background. Now, again, they weren't this size. Okay, they aren't these massive statues. What they were are little handheld things that you could keep and hold in your hand or set up a little altar inside your homes. But this is put here in this picture to say, what did the Israelites do? They started to follow the Baals, and the Baal becomes a kind of a catchphrase for all the pagan gods and goddesses. The Astartes or the Ashtoreths, as they're sometimes used, those would be the female. So there's Baal is technically male, Ashtoreth, Astarte, female. And so sometimes you'll hear both. And occasionally you hear about some of the names of the other gods, but the catchword in the Bible is the Baals. And so this pattern now begins. They do something that's evil. God hands them over to their enemies and they plunder them, right? But that's not the end of the story. Somebody take up 16 through the end of the chapter.
Then the Lord raised up judges. But they did not listen to the judges. They left it after it had died and bowed down to him. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked. They had obeyed him. They did not follow the example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge. For the Lord would be moved pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not stop. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant, and that's remembered their ancestors, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left in them, in order to test Israel whether or not they would take care or walk in the way of the Lord as their ancestors did. The Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua.
Now we'll hear a little different explanation in chapter 3 about why those nations were left. But here's what you go, right? And notice the language. Let's see here. Where was it? In verse 17, they lusted after other gods. What other you've got different translations here. You have other words besides that? Prostituted. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes another translation will say they went a whoring after other gods. Remember this picture that we had previously back in chapter 10? This is the understanding of those Canaanite fertility religions, that human beings can manipulate the gods. And the reason it rains, and when it rains, you have crops, and all that comes with crops, is because the male gods and female gods are sexually intimate. So if you're not having enough rain, you do these sexual rituals in your worship, and that encourages the gods to do the same. It's this kind of weird cycle, but that's why in the Old Testament it's often referred to as lusting or prostituting or a whoring after these other gods, because it's always this the fertility cults are sexual in nature. But what happens when the people are under the pressure of the people that are attacking them or brutalizing them? They cry out, right? And then God has mercy. God raises up a judge, and as long as the judge is alive, everything's going well. But as soon as the judge dies, they go back to doing what they were doing before. There are some interesting passages. Again, verse 17. It says, for they lusted after other gods, bowed down to them. And then what's the rest of verse 17 say?
They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, who did not follow their example. And
you're kind of thinking to yourself, now, which ancestors were those, right? Because it's always like, every section we go through, they're not following. And this is what becomes really fascinating. We'll see this later on when we get to some of the prophets, is that time in the wilderness is actually gets lifted up as a time where the people were faithful. Even though we just read how much they were grumbling and whining and complaining all the time. Yes, they were doing all those things, but they were not worshiping other gods. And so you get the sense for the writers here that the big deal is worshiping foreign gods. And of course, that's that warning that Moses made all the way through Deuteronomy. So we saw it in Joshua. We're going to see it here as we work our way through. And so the cycle will continue. Okay.
So they didn't do the repeat of the stipulations and everything. That I take it they kind of discontinued doing that they weren't aware of what was happening.
We have that great covenant renewal at the end of Joshua. We won't get anything kind of akin to that. And we'll see a few things here and there with someone like with Samuel, or with David, or with Solomon, or with Josiah, or Hezekiah, some of the kings. But by and large, surprise, surprise, people are going to do what they want to do. And I mean, bring it into a contemporary context, right? I mean, we have to acknowledge that people who may worship regularly, support the church financially, even become part of the leadership of the church, don't always do what they should, right? Pastors and priests, people who are standing up front and leading God's people in work, we don't always do what we're supposed to do. I mean, so this common failure of humanity to be what God calls us to be is consistent there. That doesn't get them off the hook, but I always try and remind myself of that, because it's so easy to go, God, those people were so stupid, or they were so evil, or they were so wicked, or they just didn't, and it's like, well, hey, buddy, look in the mirror, because we can do the very same thing. But yeah, you wonder, you scratch your head sometimes and think, how could they be so thick? And yet, this is how we often are as people. And I think we already had it. I don't remember the exact page in here, but it may have been back in chapter 10 when we looked at this picture, that the Bible scholars estimate, the quote was something like, Bible scholars estimate that 90% of the Israelites worship the Baals 90% of the time throughout that whole sweep of history that we covered some, and we've got much more to get through as we work our way through. But it's really easy, isn't it, to be unfaithful. It's really easy to stray from the path. Well, chapter 3 begins like this. It says, now these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that successive generations of Israelites might know war to teach to those who had no experience of it before. And then we get this list: the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites and the Sidonians and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. These were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. And you're just going, this is not going to be good. But here is a sense in which the Canaanites were left behind as they came to understand this, so that they could learn how to fight. Not just physically battle, but the spiritual battles, right? And haven't you ever asked yourself, how come God doesn't just remove all the temptations in the world so that I don't get tempted? I mean, you know, we ask similar sorts of questions here. And what comes now for the next several chapters is a listing of these various judges, champions, chieftains. Some of them we get lots of information about. Some of them we get a verse or even part of a verse, right? So let's look at the picture, if you will. Here's what we're going to be seeing as we work our way through. And again, we don't know if these are always necessarily immediately see this, you know, Othniel all happens and then nothing happens until the Ehud, and then nothing happens. We don't know if it's like that or if some of these things are happening in overlapping ways, but we will get this. We will get the attacking neighbor and the delivering judge or chieftain or champion. And we'll hear about how the Moabites come and fight. And we hear about Ehud. We'll hear about how the Canaanites come and fight. And then we have Deborah and Barak. We'll hear about the Midianites and the Amalekites coming. And we'll hear about Gideon. And we'll hear about how the Ammonites come and Jephthah in that story. We'll hear about the Philistines. And we hear about Samson. And then we'll zero in and hear a little bit about how the tribe of Dan connects with Ephraim and eventually relocates from down here to up here. Okay. And it's really interesting. We referenced it before when we were reading that the writer would talk about Dan up here in the north. So it gave you a sense that some of the narrative that we already read occurred after this. It was talking about what happened before, but it wasn't until after that it occurred. And so here then is a little table, and I think you've got this in your book on page 27, which gives the name of the oppressor, which in this instance is kind of one person, and sometimes it's just a people group, so it varies. But you've got these lists of these oppressors, how long they were oppressing. You hear the judge who was raised up and the tribe that they came from, if we're told that, and then how many years that person ruled after they had dealt with the problem created by the oppressor. And it doesn't mention it here in this little picture, but at the bottom of the graphic on page 27, it says those in bold are sometimes referred to as major judges, while those in non-bold are minor judges. Major, minor, not important, unimportant, or less important, but major simply means there's a lot of text that tells us about them. Minor, we just get a little sketch of what's happening there. Okay. Any questions so far where we're at here? Then let's take a peek at some things. Here's this cycle, and this is referenced on page 29. And we read it in chapter 2. Apostasy, fancy word for people turning away from God. The people sin, they worship the Baals. Battering, probably not the best word to use anymore, but as a result of their worshiping, as they're turning their backs on God, you can say God sort of turns his back temporarily on them and lets this bad stuff happen to them. Then the people cry out to the Lord for help. And then the Lord delivers them by raising up a judge. And then I like to add the letter E, if you want, A, B, C, D, E, because E, everything go back to the top and start over, because we go cycle after cycle after cycle. So it's kind of a fun way to remember what's happening here. I'm going to go back to this picture also for just a minute, because you can't help but notice some of these numbers. They're not all perfect, but you've got, with the judges, you've got 40 for Othniel, 80 for Ehud, 40 for Deborah, 40 for Gibeon. Jephthah has 6, Samson has 20. And the question always gets raised, when are the numbers in the Bible just numbers? And when are the numbers in the Bible symbolic? And nobody has a perfect answer for that. But it certainly seems possible that 40 is sort of a normal length of time. 80 would be a long time. 20 would be half a time. 10 would be a real short time. Hard to tell. But again, we do this with numbers as well. The example I always like to use is the child who says back to their mom or their teacher or their dad, I know you already told me 1,000,000 times. Well, no, we really didn't tell you 1,000,000 times. But 1,000,000 there becomes not 1,000,000. 1,000,000 is just a symbolic of, you keep telling me. It's okay, I gotcha, So we do that at times with numbers. But there is then, as we follow this cycle here, that's what page 29, and it gives you this framework. Now, the framework doesn't always get followed, but if you can see point 2 on page 29, it says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord by, fill in the blank. So the Lord gave them over to, fill in the blank, who oppressed them for, fill in the blank years. When the Israelites cried to the Lord raised up, fill in the blank with the name of that champion to deliver them. The story of the judge is then recounted and closed with, and the land enjoyed peace for however many years. I mean, it just, that pattern continues to be going. And it is interesting. And it's why I don't like battering. I know he did this because he's trying to get, A, B, C, D, it kind of fancy, but it really talks about the Lord gave them up to. And this again is this pattern that we see over and over and over and over again in the Bible, Old Testament and New. Romans chapter 1 will talk about this, how God gave them up. So it's sort of like if you and I or anybody's going to persist in sin, God will say, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. But ultimately, if we're going to say, I'm still going to do it, then God says, fine, and you're going to love it. And it's this kind of almost horrible sort of judgment that when we don't heed the call of the Spirit to turn. God says, fine, you're going to want to do that, then now you're going to need to do that, or you're going to love to do that, or it's going to dominate you. If that's what you want, and fun, dominate comes from the Latin word dominus, and dominus is the Latin word for Lord. So if we're going to pursue sin, God's going to let sin be our Lord. Isn't that a scary way to word it? but it's kind of what you see. All right, so that's all the illustrations in here. So let's go to the text and spend some time with that. Well, here's a short one. Who wants to read about Othniel? Bet you knew about him. But let's see the pattern. Somebody read. Joshua chapter 3, verse 7 through 11.
The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot about the Lord their God, and they served the images of Baal and Asherah poles. When the Lord burned with anger against Israel, he turned them over to King King C of A. And the Israelites served C for the 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Othniel, and the son of Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he became Israel's judge. He went to war against King C of Aram, and the Lord gave Othniel victory over him. So there was peace in the land for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died.
Okay. And you don't always hear this, but in verse 10, important phrase. First time we hear it, the Spirit of the Lord came upon. And so we're gonna see that occur sometimes in Judges. We're gonna see that occur sometimes in some of the other people we'll meet in this journey. And of course, when we get to the New Testament, Jesus's baptism, we're gonna hear about how the Spirit of the Lord descended upon Jesus, and some of the gospel writers say, and remained on him. And so just a little teaser of kind of where we're going. But so here's Othniel. And now my son's favorite Bible character comes next. Who would like to read the story of Ehud?
The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of Palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber and said, I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh and thrust it into Eglon's belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. There was their Lord lying dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculptured stones and escaped to S. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head. He said to them, Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and allowed no one to cross over. At that time, it killed about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. No one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 8 years.
All right. So you can see why a teenage boy of a demented pastor might think that story is really, really funny. But yeah, it was, there is certainly some humor in the midst of the gore, right? The guy is so fat that when you stab him, the fat eventually swallows up the sword. And of course, the dirt coming out, that's a very polite euphemism for saying he messed his pants as a result of this. And so when he locks the door and sort of sneaks his way out, and the servants they're wondering where their master is, and oh, we know what he's doing. He's busy going to the bathroom. We'll give him some time to do that, which of course they didn't realize he was dead. But finally they're thinking, man, it's never taken him this long before to go. I mean, it is kind of hilarious in some way. But this is another example of a judge, right? Well, then you get Shamgar, and you get not very much about him, right? But let's read about the only female judge. Somebody want to read? And any of you know, so Jewish women named this are Deborah. We say Deborah, but it's Deborah. And sometimes you'll see a V instead, because the V is really the Hebrew letter bait can be a V or a B. And so sometimes you'll see Deborah that way. But who would like to read? Somebody take the first 10 verses.
The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jahab of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in the Harosheth Hagrim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and had opposed the Israelites cruelly 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lephadoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah called Ramah in Bethel, in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abimelech, and Kadesh of Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position in Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 of the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabez's army, to meet you at the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Canaan.
So there's the setup, right? And so interesting, we hear here that Deborah is a prophetess. She's a prophet, and she's also a judge, right? It says verse 4, she was judging Israel. So she did what the Lord told her to do to get Barak ready to go. He didn't want to go by himself. So she said, fine, I'll go with you. But now it's not going to be you. It's going to be somebody else. And then we get this little aside about Heber, the Kenite, who'd separated from the other Kenites. And he's going to show up in the story a little bit later. So somebody else pick up verses 12 through 16.
Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, he called for all 900 of his iron chariots and all of his warriors, and they marched from H to the Kishon River. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Get ready. This is the day the Lord will give you victory over Sisera, for the Lord is marching ahead of you." So Barak led his 10,000 warriors down the slopes of the Mount Tabor into battle. When Barak attacked, the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and warriors into a panic. Sisera leapt down from his chariot and escaped on foot. When Barak chased the chariots and the enemy army all the way to H, killing all of Sisera's warriors, not a single one of them left alive.
All right, so great destruction at the hand of the Lord. But now the leader, the king, Sisera, what happens to him? Somebody pick up from there.
Meanwhile, Sisera ran to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because Heber's family was on friendly terms with the king Jabin of Hazor. Jael went out to meet Sisera and told him, "Come into my tent, sir. Come in, don't be afraid." So he went into her tent and she covered him with a blanket. "Please give me some water," he said. "I'm thirsty." So she gave him some milk from a leather bag and covered him again. Stand at the door of the tent," he told her. "If anyone comes and asks you if there is anyone here, say no." But when Sisera fell asleep from exhaustion, Jael quietly crept up to him with a hammer and tent peg in her hand. Then she drove the tent peg through his temple and into the ground, and so he died. When Barak came looking for Sisera, Jael went out to meet him. She said, "Come, and I will show you the man you are looking for." So he followed her into the tent and found Sisera lying there dead with the tent peg through his temple. So that day Israel saw God defeat Jabin, the Canaanite king, and from that time on Israel became stronger and stronger against King Jabin until they finally destroyed him.
All right. So, yeah, that's why I don't give my wife camping gear for Christmas. No, but anyway. Yeah, it's like, yeah, right? Let's see if I can do this. I don't know if this will work on let's see if I've got it here handy. I think I do. So I had a buddy of mine send me something. Back here a little bit. Thursday, go back to Thursday. Oh, did it get blurry?
Okay.
So there, apparently you can get this Bible scene on a coffee mug.
All right.
Isn't that funny? Got to get it just right, otherwise it doesn't go through here, but anyway, whatever it is. So anyhow, yeah. Whoop, yippee. Just what everybody needs. So, yeah, but you can memorialize anything on a coffee mug, apparently. That's kind of fun. Yeah. So now chapter 5 is kind of a poetic retelling, right? Chapter 4 is narrative. Chapter 5 is a poetic retelling, and basically of this same thing, which includes a praise in verse 24, "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite," right? Now, depending on your faith background, we're usually think who gets described as most blessed of women? Mary, right? But so here this is, she's a tent dwelling woman, she's blessed, and he asked for water, she gave him milk, she gave him a little something, right? And then she put the tent peg in her hand and the workman's mallet, and she struck a blow. He sank, he fell at her feet. It's like, wow, okay, kind of nasty stuff. But it ends with, "And the land had rest for 40 years.
And why did they call her most blessed of the women? Because she defeated an enemy?
She defeated this enemy general who had been fighting against them for, almost 20 years. Yep. She rescued them. She was their champion. She was their one who God used to do this. So yeah, it's and then it ends with, look at verse 31. So perish all your enemies, O God, but may your friends be like the sun as it rises in its might. Right? We'll hear passages like this, may God do such and so to me and more if I do not. It's that kind of oaths and things that would be made. Well, chapter 6, we hear about another. Here's the cycle. Somebody take 1 to 10. We'll read the story of Gideon.
The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "The land of slavery, I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hands of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live." But you have not listened.
So somebody asked earlier, well, what about, don't they have any more of these covenant ceremonies? Well, here's a kind of a mini one, right? This nameless prophet, we don't know who it is, comes and speaks the way prophets speak, right? Thus says the Lord. When we get to the units on the prophets, we're going to get into this in much more detail, but essentially a prophet speaks for God. That's their role. That's what they do. And this prophet gives, thus says the Lord, preamble. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, right? There's your historical thing. You're supposed to obey. You're not supposed to pay reverence to other gods. So there's the first 3 parts of the covenant. And then, but you have not given heed to my voice. And so what's going to come when they don't keep the covenant? The curses. And they're living those and experiencing those. But this story continues. That's kind of the setup and the introduction to the story. Somebody read the next through verse 20, or just go through verse 18 to start with the call of Gideon.
The angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak at Ophrah. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not Oprah, but it's almost.
Which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty warrior." Gideon answered him, "But sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our ancestors recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has cast us off and given us into the hand of Midian." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. I hereby commission you." He responded, "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites, every one of them." Then he said to him, "If now I have found favor with you, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you." And he said, "I will stay with you Stay until you return.
Does this sound at all familiar? Any elements of this narrative? Does it not sound like what happened with Moses, right? And some excuses, right, that are there. But this, but wait, if God's with us, verse 13, how come all this junk's happening, right? Where's all the wonderful things we heard you do? I mean, this is repeated generation after generation. Well, Gideon goes to make a little offering, right? And somebody pick up 19 through 24.
So Gideon went into his house and prepared a pit, and unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him in the open to send to them. The angel of God said, take the meat and the unleavened cakes, and put them on this broth, and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord reached out, and took the staff, and that was in his hand, and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes. And fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that it was the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, help me, Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, I speak to you, do not fear, you shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord, and called it the Lord is peace. To this day it still stands at which belongs to the Aboriginals.
All right. So he comes to offer this offering, and it gets lit on fire, and the angel disappears. We're going to see a similar thing happen with Samson in the story, if you got a chance to read that. But he's afraid, right? I've seen God. How am I going to live? Well, that kind of expression will happen over and over, even including into the New Testament. After the miraculous catch of fish, Peter falls on his knees and says, depart from me, for I am a sinner, right? So humanity in the full presence of God yields this kind of concern of life. Well, what happens is the angel tells him now to take his father's bull and cut down the Asherah pole and the sacred pole, use it to burn a sacrifice. And they do that. He's afraid, so he does it at night. The next morning when the people get up, they see this altar destroyed, and they're going to say, what the heck's going to happen? And now he gets a new name. He gets Jerubbaal. This is in verse 32. And they're ready to fight, but he's not quite ready yet. He wants the fleece. Somebody read that fun little narrative in 36 through the end of the chapter.
Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next morning. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew of the bowl of water. And Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew.
All right. So he still wasn't quite sure about all this. And so he wanted God, I don't mean this disrespectfully, to do a couple little parlor tricks just to make sure. Let me get some certainty here. And so that's what he does. And he gathers the troops. And how many does he gather? No, not to start with. 20. He has what? 32,000, right? And God sees that number and says, too many, right? And so in verse 3 of chapter 7, he's allowed to say, okay, who's ever nervous about this, you can go home. What happens? 22 of the 32,000 say, yeah, I'm out of here. Now he's got 10,000. Guess what? Too many. right? Yep, and so now they're gonna go down to the river to get a drink. And whoever laps like a dog is gonna get put on one side, and those who kneel down to drink, putting their hands to their mouths, you're gonna set to the other side. And there's 300 who lap like dogs. What's the deal? The deal is if you go down and stick your head in the water and drink, the enemies are going to be able to sneak up on you, right? You're not a very skilled warrior. Whereas if you go down to drink and you put your hand in and bring water up, you can see what's going on. You've got some skills, they're sent home. And so it's just the klutzes who are left, right? In essence. And what do? They take a lamp, they take their sword, they take a jar, and I'm not sure how you balance all this stuff, but they go and they surround the camp and they're going to attack. But before that happens, he gets one more little assurance. Somebody read verses 9 through the end of that story. This is chapter 7, verse 9.
That night, the Lord said, "Get up, go down into the Midian camp, for I have given you victory over them. But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you will be greatly encouraged. Then you will be eager to attack." So Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. The armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the people of the east had settled in the valley like a swarm of locusts. Their camels were like grains of the sand on the seashore, too many to count. Gideon crept up just as a man was telling his companion about a dream. The man said, "I had this dream, and in my dream a loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp. It hit a tent, turned over, and knocked it flat." This companion answered, "Your dream can only mean one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite, victory over Midian and all its allies." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed and worshipped before the Lord. Then he returned to the Israelite camp and shouted, "Get up, for the Lord has given you victory over the Midianite hordes." He divided the 300 men into 3 groups and gave each a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. Then he said to them, "Keep your eyes on me. When I come to the edge of the camp, do just as I do. As soon as I and those with me blow the ram's horns, blow your horns too all around the entire camp and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" It was just after midnight, after the changing of the guard, when Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the Midianite camp. Suddenly they blew the ram's horn and broke their clay jars. Then all 3 groups blew their horns and broke their jars. They held the blazing torches in their left hands and the horns in their right hands, and they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Each man stood at his position around the camp and watched as all the Midianites rushed around in a panic, shouting as they ran to escape. When the 300 Israelites blew their ram's horn, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their swords. Those who were not killed fled to the places far away as B near Z and to the border of A near Tabbath. Gideon sent for the warriors of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, who joined in chasing the army of Midian. Gideon also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down to attack the Midianites, cut them off at the shallow crossings near the Jordan River at Beth-barah." So all the men of Ephraim did as they were told. They captured Oreb and Zeb and the two Midianite commanders, killing Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. And they continued to chase the Midianites after the Israelites brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan River.
Okay, so a rather miraculous battle, right? Somewhat akin to Jericho, except rather than being in an enclosed city, it's this massive army. And by the way, if you're familiar with sort of epic tales like Lord of the Rings, for example, you'll notice in a lot of these tales, it's always people from the East are the bad guys. So even in those tales, the same kind of thing are happening. But the story will continue on into the next chapter. We're not going to read through all of it, but Gideon is eventually conquering, even though some of the cities aren't going to give him help to do it. And then there's some discipline that comes later on. But then finally, at the end of the narrative, verse 22 in chapter 8, somebody read 22 to 28. Or I can. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you've delivered us out of the hand of Midian. In other words, they want to make him king, and have set up a dynasty. He says, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Sounds good, right? Well, but what comes next doesn't sound very good. Then Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Each of you give me an earring that he has taken as a booty, because the enemy had golden earrings, and because they were Ishmaelites. He said, we will willingly give them. So they spread out a garment, each threw into it an earring that he had taken as booty. The weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. And that doesn't even count the crescents and the pendants, the purple garments that the kings of Midian wore, and the collars that were on the necks of their camels. And then it says, Gideon made an ephod, which is a religious article, out of it and put it in his town in Ophrah, and all Israel prostituted to it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and they lifted up their heads no more. So the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. So it's like, it's good, but it's not good, right? And then we hear about Gideon's death. And he went to live in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons, and he had many wives. His concubine was a Shechem, bore him a son, named him Abimelech. And Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites relapsed and prostituted themselves with the Baals, making Baal Berit their god. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hand of all their enemies on every side, and they did not exhibit loyalty to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good he had done. And you're just going, how much more of this do we have to go? And the answer is much of the rest of the book. And we probably won't get a chance in this lesson to read everything. And we're going to actually spend some time with the closing chapters that don't even talk about the judges. And if you got a chance to read, this stuff's even worse than what we read about in the judges. I mean, it's crazy. Now, Abimelech, who is the son of a concubine, right? So sort of like an unofficial child, is who is next in there. And he actually kills all but one of his half-brothers in the process. The half-brother has this very interesting parable as he's going to taunt his brother to say, well, you know, this bramble, right, went out to, you know, the trees, all the trees wanted someone to rule, and all the important trees says, I don't want to rule. I got much more important business bearing fruit or doing these things. But this, you know, this tumbleweed is what we'd call it back home. This tumbleweed says, well, I'll be king, you know. This taunt, and eventually Abimelech will die, and he'll die in a most ignoble way. How does he die? Yeah, this woman drops this millstone on him, and he's so aware of how embarrassing this is that he asks one of his buddies to kill him, to finish him off, right? So you get this sort of sense of that. And chapter 9 ends with, and God also made all the wickedness of Shechem fall back on their heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal. So you're just going, oh my goodness. Well, we then get a teeny little bit of information about two more of these chieftains or champions, Tola and Jair, but not told a heck of a lot, right? And then verse 6 of chapter 10, by now you've heard this and probably can repeat it, right? Then the Israelites did again evil in the sight of the Lord, right? However your translation says it. And here they're talked about quite a list, right? I'll read. Or no, somebody else can read. 6 through 9. You get to read all these names of these gods and goddesses. You want me to do it? Okay. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, worshiping the Baals and the Astartes, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. Right? You get this sense? All these different gods. Thus they abandoned the Lord and did not worship him. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hand of the Ammonites, and they crushed and oppressed the Israelites that year. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites that were beyond the Jordan in the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah and against Benjamin and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was greatly distressed. Right? So it's almost as if it's ratcheted up even more. And the people cry out to the Lord. Right? We have sinned against you. We've abandoned our God. We've worshiped the Baals. And the Lord said, somebody read 11 through the end of the chapter.
Did I not deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites, and the Ammonites and the Philistines, the Sidonians, whatever. Also, and the Amalekites and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried to me, and I delivered you out of their hand. Yet you have abandoned me and worshipped other gods. Therefore, I will deliver you no more. Go and cry to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your distress. And the Israelites said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you, and deliver us this day. So they put away the foreign gods from among them and worshiped the Lord, and he could no longer bear to see Israel suffer. Then the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped in Gilead, and the Israelites came together, and they encamped at Mizpah. The commanders of the people of Gilead said to one another, who will begin the fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over the inhabitants of Gilead.
And now we transfer into Jephthah. But again, you get this sense, right? And even I think about that passage where Peter comes to Jesus and says, okay, Lord, how many times, if my brother sins against me and he asks for forgiveness, how many times do I got to forgive him? Seven times? And Jesus says, depending on which version, 7 times or 70 times, 7 times, right? I mean, it's a lot, right? But you get this sense of, oh my gosh, these people, the story just keeps repeating itself over and over and over and over. And of course, the Jephthah himself is sort of an illegitimate son. And so he's cast out. He gets a band of people who join him, but eventually the people realize that they need the kind of skill that he has developed, and they call him in, and then he makes this rather rash vow, right? But let's go to verse 29 of chapter 11. 29 to 33, I guess, at this point.
And the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh. He passed on to Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return victorious from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. He inflicted a massive defeat on them from A to the neighborhood of M, 20 towns, and as far as A. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel.
Now remember, Middle Eastern homes, if they're living in homes as opposed to tents, are usually 2 levels. There's a ground level that you walk in with a little bit of an entryway, and then you'll go up a few steps into the living level, which is where the family lived. That ground level is their stable, right? Don't think of them as having a house and then somewhere over elsewhere they've got a place for the animals. That's not the lot of most common folk. And so, sort of thinking positively about Jephthah here, he's probably figuring that the first thing out the door is going to be one of the animals. And he's basically saying, God, I will sacrifice whatever animal comes out of my house, not even thinking for a moment that who's going to come out? His daughter, and she's his only child. And it's a tragic, sad kind of ending to this story. And the girl herself says, no, Dad, you have to keep your promise to God. But she says, let me go and wander in the mountains and bewail my virginity for 2 months. And we're hearing that then this has become sort of like this ongoing practice among the people for the days after that. So Jephthah, another one of the judges. Then there's a little bit of infighting, and you get the sense, this is, if you've ever heard about this, will get talked about as a shibboleth. And that's where this comes from, is that they're fugitives. They can't pronounce a word in a certain way. And so that becomes, if you will, another phrase, it becomes a password. If they can say shibboleth, then you can get in. That's the password. But if that's not your what's the word I'm fishing for here? Your dialect. Thank you. That's not your dialect. You say sibboleth. And the same Hebrew letter can be with an SH or just an S still today. And so sibboleth, well, then we know you're one of those foreigners, and they would kind of cut you off. And so we heard about the death of what, 42,000. This is amazing, right? But as Jephthah dies, a couple of other things are there, and then we get somebody we know about, Samson. And fascinating, you may have noticed, chapter 13, chapter 14, chapter 15, and chapter 16 are all dedicated to Samson. So by far and away, the largest chunk of material in this book is given over to Samson, who's fighting somebody that will continue to be fought against for many years in the story, because it begins with the Israelites did what was evil, again, what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines. And once again, I believe that Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, had the Philistines in mind when he created the Klingons. And there's this constant, right, in that whole Star Trek saga, especially in the original, there's this constant battle with the Philistines, with the Klingons and these warriors. So who knows? But it is sort of interesting. And we hear about this miraculous birth, right? It's not the first time we're going to hear about this. And this child is going to be a Nazirite. He's not going to cut his hair and never have anything that is related to grapes or wine. And he's going to be, so you've got this sort of this prediction of this child, this male child who's going to be born, right? And we'll pick this up with Samuel. Obviously, we get some of these connections with Jesus going ahead, but it is kind of interesting. And so that's chapter 13 is sort of all about his birth. And once again, we hear how the angel appears and they think, oh my gosh, when they offer this sacrifice, we're done for, but it's not the case. And it is kind of interesting that they ask the angel to kind of help teach us how to raise this child. And chapter 13 ends with the phrase, the woman bore a son and named him Samson. The boy grew, and the Lord blessed him. The Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Now, keep your finger there for just a minute and go to 1 Samuel. And look at 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 19 to the end. And even sneaks over a little bit into chapter 4. But notice how it says Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, let none of his words fall to the ground, and all Israel from Dan, that's the tribe of Samson, to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. And the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord, and the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now, go to Luke chapter 2. And look at the closing verses there. In fact, even before, in verse 39, this is after the presentation in the temple with Simeon and Anna. Somebody read verses 39 and 40. And the next story is about the boy Jesus in the temple, and look at verse 52. So that kind of theme of this chosen one or this appointed one of God, we pick it up here already with Samson. But of course, as we know, the Samson story isn't always good. He has a particular weakness, right? And his weakness is women. And so we will hear about that. And isn't it interesting when you're talking about one of your heroes, you're talking about your hero's weakness? Again, it's one of the unique things about the scriptures is that it's not all whitewashed. We saw, or we will see when we get to Chronicles, that David is painted very nicely in the book of Chronicles. But when we read about David and Samuel, we'll see that kind of warts and all here. And so we have this marriage to the Philistine woman, and that leads to some destruction. And then there's more battles. And Samson, as your text sort of describes it, is kind of like a one-man army, right? Or a one-man wrecking crew. So much so that the Philistine lords, the 5 lords, because there's 5 Philistine towns, they finally say, we've got to get this guy done, right? And chapter 16 is where this occurs. Chapter 16 begins with yet another indiscretion on the part of Samson. But somebody pick up in 16 verses like 4 through 12.
After this, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, coax him and find out what makes his strength so great, and how we may overpower him, so that we may bind him in order to subdue him. We will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me what makes your strength so great, and how you could be bound so that one could subdue you. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that are not dried out, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else. And the lords of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried out, and she bound them with it. While the men were lying in wait in the inner chamber, she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps when it touches the fire. Well, the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you could be bound." He said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you." Samson, the men lying in wait were in the inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you could be bound." He said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and make it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web and made them tight with the pin. Then she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he woke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web.
All right, so this attempt after attempt after attempt, but now it shifts. Somebody pick up 15 through 22.
And she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you don't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazarite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more, he has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair and began to subdue him. All his strength left him. Then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go up as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. When the Philistines seized him, then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him into a grinding grain in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after he'd been shaved.
Okay, so now and that phrase, "but the hair of his head began to grow again." And somebody can finish off the Samson story for us.
The Philistine rulers had a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, "Our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy to us. The one who killed so many of us is now in our power." Half drunk by now, the people demanded, "Bring out Samson so he can amuse us." So he was brought from the prison to amuse them. And they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, "Place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them." Now the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, "Let me die with the Philistines." And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. Later, his brothers and other relatives went down to get his body. They took him back home and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol. where his father Manoah was buried. Samson had judged Israel for 20 years.
He's the last of the judges in the book of Judges. We'll get to the final judge, who is Samuel. And in many ways, Samuel also becomes the first of the prophets, although you can see we've had some prophets and prophetesses along the way, but at least as the narrative goes. But before we're finished with Judges, we have 5 very unpleasant chapters. What is interesting and sad in these chapters also gets repeated a number of times. Look at chapter 17, verse 6. Look at chapter 18, verse 1. Look at chapter 19, verse 1. And then look at the very last verse in the book of Judges. When we get to this final section with its great unpleasantness, and certainly don't even the book of Judges, you don't have to tell anybody the Bible is not a book for kids. But when we get to these final chapters, it may not even be a book for an adult sometimes, depending on how able you are to read very unpleasant things. But it's interesting that beginning in chapter 17 and ending with the final verse of chapter 25, remember the chapters themselves are arbitrarily stuck in there. But this final section of the book of Judges, we have this recurring theme that will tie us in with what comes next, because in our next section, we're going to see them the whole conversation about is the problem that the Israelites are facing that they don't have a king? Is that their problem? And the narrative will pick that up. But so chapter 17 talks about a guy named Micah who stole 1,100 pieces of silver from his mom. Now, we're not told this, but Delilah was paid 1,100 pieces of silver from the 5 Philistine lords. Now, maybe the numbers just line up that way. We really don't know. And I'm not aware of anybody who suggests that Micah is her son, but it's a continuation of this. And his mom's so happy to get this money back. And by the way, that's a ton of money. She decides to use some of it to make an idol. And you're going, wait a minute, what? And then she decides that Micah is going to have this shrine, and he gets one of his own sons to become a priest. And that's why it interjects with verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel, right? Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. But then you hear about this man from Bethlehem but he's not, Bethlehem belongs to Judah, but he's not from the tribe of Judah. He's a Levite. Remember, and the Levites are the ones who are supposed to carry out the religious functions of the people. And have you noticed we've heard nothing about the Ark of the Covenant? We've heard nothing about the tabernacle. That's just all of a sudden, all that stuff has vanished in here. But this Levite comes, and when Micah finds him, he says, now he can have a real priest, right? And he says at the end of the final verse of chapter 17, Micah said, now I know that the Lord will prosper me because the Levite has become my priest. Little gimmicky, right? Just do worship right and God will bless you. You've got some sometimes well-known speakers who will make that kind of claim, all right? So, and they can certainly grab on a passage like this to justify what they're doing, but if they miss the irony, it's there. Well, what happens? Story continues, chapter 18, and it continues with the phrase, there's no king in Israel. But the Danites, the territory they were in wasn't working. And so they go and scout out new land. And as a part of their journey, they bump into this Micah's property and his own little private priest. And he does a little, divining for them. And in verse 6 of chapter 18, he says, go in peace. The mission you are on is under the eyes of the Lord. And so they go up north, they find this territory that looks like we can conquer this. They come back and they send a group of 600 people out to fight. But while on the way, they decide to grab this priest. And Micah's not too excited about it, but they're more intimidating to him than he is to them. And the Danites settle up north, and that territory becomes Dan, and Micah's idol is put there. And it even mentions, doesn't it, that some of Moses's sons, right? Look at verse 30. Then the Danites set up the idol for themselves. Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribes of the Danites. So they've got it set. They've got Moses's descendants, his grandsons, serving as priests. And you go, what is going on here? Well, later on in the story, we're going to hear about a northern kingdom or northern king setting up a worship place in Dan. And so this is like greasing the skids for that story. Well, this wasn't as bad as what comes next. Because we hear about another Levite who has a concubine that he apparently mistreated. And again, remember, concubine is the Bible's word for a mistress. It's not his wife, but it's someone that he will sexually use. And so, this is messy, ugly kind of stuff. But she finally takes off, and even though he's described as her husband, the fact that she's described as concubine, it's a little different that way. But anybody who has any sort of counseling therapy is saying, yeah, we got a domestic abuse going on here in this story. And now he feels bad, and he goes and he talks nice to her, and he's trying to bring her. It's just going, this is not going to end good. And it doesn't, right? Because he finally goes back to where she lives. He spends time with his father-in-law, as it's described here, and he keeps wanting to go, but the father-in-law keeps wanting him to stay. And so finally, kind of party after party after party after party. And you got to figure this poor gal didn't have such a good upbringing either. But in any event, they finally leave, but they're leaving quite late. And so by the time they get moving, they're not going to stay in Gibeah, or let's see, wait a minute. They're not going to stay in the Jebusites. So that's Jerusalem. They're going to keep going till they at least get to a town that belongs to themselves, which is Gibeah. But when they get there, it's not good, right? It's late. It's towards sundown. They're hoping someone will welcome them in, but nobody does until this old guy comes in, and he brings him into his house. The people of that tribe were Benjaminites, and looks like it's going to end up okay. And then it comes in verse 22 and following. I'll read. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house, started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him, right? So you're thinking this is Sodom and Gomorrah all over again. And that what comes next in the narrative is hard for us to understand because we typically don't know about Middle Eastern hospitality. But when you invite a guest, welcome a guest into your home, he is under your protection. You'll do anything to protect him, including the horrible things that get mentioned next. The master of the house, went out and said, don't be so wicked, right? This man is my guest. Don't do this vile thing. Here's my virgin daughter. Here's his concubine. We'll let them come out to you. Ravish them. Do whatever you want to them, but do nothing against this man. Well, we don't hear about his daughter, but the concubine is pushed out. And I mean, the words are pretty strong. In this translation, it says in verse 25, they wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night until the morning. I mean, it's ugly, right? She collapses at the front door and dies. And you'll forgive me, but this jackass the next morning gets up and gives her a little shove and says, hey, lady, come on, we got to move. I mean, this is horrible. And he realizes that there's no answer. He puts her on his donkey. He gets home. And then, again, gross to gross, right? Chops her up in pieces, sends out to all of the other tribes and says, this is what the Benjaminites have done. And so all the other tribes attack the Benjaminites and all but obliterate one of their own tribes. And there's 600 left when they realize that they've all but obliterated one of the 12 tribes. And so they call a pause to this, but all there are left are these 600 guys, and there's no women. So if there's no women, there's going to be no continuation of the tribe. And so then they discover that the town of Jabesh Gilead hadn't sent anybody along because everybody else made this vow, we will never do anything to help the Benjaminites out, including giving them our daughters as husbands or as wives. And so they go and they destroy Jabesh Gilead. They managed to have 400 virgins from that, but they're still not quite done. And so then they tell these guys to go to this festival that's happening in Shiloh and just abscond with 200 more. And you're kind of going, what in the world is going on with this story? And it ends with, in those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. There's no nice way to describe, but what I can tell you is this: Jabesh Gilead's going to continue to show up in the story that comes next with Saul. So much so that some Bible scholars think either Saul's mother or grandmother. Saul was a Benjaminite, so he's a descendant of this kind of story. And one of the first things he does as king is he comes to the aid of Jabesh Gilead to rescue them. And then later when Saul dies, it's the men of Jabesh Gilead who will come and take his body, decapitated body, and his son's decapitated bodies and bring them back to Jabesh Gilead to be buried. But it's like, this is just really ugly. But inside the ugliness comes a little 4-chapter book, which actually is like, okay. And while your text doesn't talk a lot about it, we'll actually pick it up later. It is, I asked you to read it if you had time, because the story of Ruth has its own kind of tragedy and its own kind of sadness, but it also has mercy and grace and compassion and redemption and kindness. And most of the, to use sort of descriptive, right? The protagonist, right? The main characters in the story are women, and there's Boaz too. But I mean, you've got these women who, and Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite, right? She's not even an Israelite, will forsake her gods to go and be with Naomi. And of course, we get this at the end where Ruth is an ancestor of David, who will be king. And so many scholars think that's why Ruth is in here. But Ruth takes place in the time of the judges. And so it is sort of this delightful narrative with its own, like I say, ups and downs and hardships and sadnesses. But it has this very profound message. Now, it's not all pure and clean, right? Because how did Ruth let Boaz know she was available? Right? I mean, it's you know, she gets all gussied up and cleaned up, and then she uncovers his feet. And feet is a euphemism in the Bible for person's private parts. So she's, you know, I mean, it's not all, it's not rated G. Okay. It's definitely an R-rated narrative, but it is also this kind of like, okay, there's at least something redeeming in some of this. But that phrase that ends the book of Judges still sort of echoes, right? That there is no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The hope being expressed that when they have a king, people will start doing what's right. But of course, as we will see, it doesn't change. So let's take a look at your question sheet. And one thing I would just point out to you on page 35, the very last thing at the bottom. Remember how the book of Joshua sort of ended with Joshua saying, choose this day who you will serve. Well, we can see what they chose. But that whole sense of that challenge of, are you going to choose the Lord? You're going to choose Baal. And they consistently choose the Baals. But look at your question section. Just the last two is all we're really going to have time for. I hope, again, you got a chance to work some of those questions that just kind of take you through the narrative itself. But on page 14, it says, after the Israelites entered Canaan, they dabbled in two religions, the worship of God, the God of the Exodus, and Baal worship. And here's a little poem. He says, today some will argue all roads that lead to God are good. What matters it, your faith or mine? Both center on the goal divine of love's eternal brotherhood. Does the faith you follow matter? That's a profound, important question, and a risky, dangerous one in the climate and culture that we live, right? But what does Jesus say? You know the passage. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. We'll wrestle with that. But that's one of the, I sometimes call it's one of the uncomfortable challenges of being a follower of Jesus, is we have that kind of declaration there. But equally interesting to me is what points out in number 2. It says, when some people become aware that the role that idolatry and polytheism played in the life of God's Old Testament people, they're shocked and think, thank God things are different now. And then you look at two 16th century reformers, one you might know better than the other. But John Calvin would say the human mind is an idol factory. And Martin Luther in his large catechism would say, what you devote your life to is your God. What do these two statements suggest about idolatry and polytheism of today? It's there, right? I mean, we constantly find ourselves putting our trust in the wrong things. That cycle still continues. Well, we've had a long, full lesson. Let's go back to our prayers and we will finish up. I'll hang around if there are other matters that you wanna go with here. Let's pray together. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. So this chapter is an example of how we're still just scratching the surface. I'm guessing maybe for many of you, spending roughly 2 hours in the book of Judges is the most you've ever spent. And we just scratched. We didn't get a chance to get it all. That's going to continue on the cycle through, but hopefully some of these patterns have emerged, and the ugliness is different, but it's there, and it's all kind of tied in with us, right? So anyway, we'll keep at this journey. I'm gonna